The fall of Rome, the empire that ate itself. For centuries, Rome was the world. Its roads connected continents. Its laws shaped civilization. Its armies were feared across every known border. It felt permanent, and that feeling was the beginning of its end, because permanence creates complacency. Rome stopped asking how to survive. It assumed survival was guaranteed. The military was outsourced to foreign soldiers with no loyalty to the empire. The currency was weakened. Corruption spread from the top downward. Leaders changed faster than policies could, and slowly, the empire didn't fall. It dissolved, not from one great enemy, not from one catastrophic moment, but from decades of small decisions that each seemed manageable until they weren't. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor was removed, not with a battle, with a letter, because the greatest empires don't collapse overnight. They erode, one compromise at a time. The sinking of the Vasa, pride before launch. In 1628, Sweden launched what was meant to be the most powerful warship ever built, the Vasa. It was decorated with hundreds of sculptures, armed with 2 full rows of cannons, built to project the power of the Swedish Empire across the seas. Engineers had raised concerns during construction. The ship was too narrow, too top-heavy, too ambitious for its own design. But the king had given his orders, and no one wanted to deliver bad news to a king. So, the Vasa launched. On its very first voyage, in full view of the city, in front of thousands of spectators, it sank, less than a mile from shore, 30 minutes after departure. The ship that was built to terrify enemies never left its own harbor, because when fear of authority silences concern, the design fails. And it always fails at the worst possible moment. The construction of the Panama Canal. The death toll of overconfidence. Before the United States, France tried first. In the 1880s, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who had successfully built the Suez Canal, arrived in Panama with confidence. He had done it before. He believed he could do it again. But Panama was not Suez. The terrain was different. The rainfall was different. The diseases were different. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the workforce. Thousands died. Equipment rusted in the jungle humidity. The geology resisted every plan. De Lesseps refused to admit the project was failing. He continued raising funds from ordinary French investors who trusted his reputation. When the project finally collapsed, over 20,000 workers were dead, and hundreds of thousands of French citizens had lost their savings. The mistake wasn't ambition. It was applying yesterday's success to a completely different problem. Because experience is only useful when you recognize what has changed. The Irish famine, a policy, dressed as principle. In the 1840s, a disease attacked the potato crop across Ireland. For the Irish poor, the potato was not just food. It was survival, and it was gone. What followed was one of the worst famines in European history. Over 1 million people died. Another million fled. But the land was still producing food, other crops, livestock, exports. They continued to leave Ireland during the famine under armed guard, because the governing policy at the time prioritized economic principle over human reality. The market, they believed, would correct itself. It did not, because markets do not feel hunger. People do. The mistake was not the crop failure. It was the decision to treat a human catastrophe as an economic equation, and the cost was a generation. The Maginot Line, preparing for the last war. After World War I, France built something extraordinary. A fortified line of bunkers, barriers, and defenses stretching along the border with Germany. It was called the Maginot Line, and it was genuinely impressive. Thick concrete, heavy artillery, underground tunnels. France was ready for World War I. In 1940, Germany did not attack the Maginot Line. They went around it, through Belgium, through the forests of Ardennes, terrain the French considered impassable. The most expensive defense system in history was bypassed in days, because military strength built around past conflict is not strength. It is preparation for the wrong battle. The enemy you fear rarely attacks where you expect. New Coke, fixing what wasn't broken. In 1985, Coca-Cola made a decision that stunned the world. They changed the formula. After nearly a century, they replaced the original recipe with something new, something they believed was better. Tests suggested people preferred the new taste. Data supported the decision. Everything pointed in the right direction. And within weeks, the backlash was unlike anything the company had experienced. Customers were furious, not because the taste was terrible, but because Coca-Cola was more than a drink. It was memory, comfort, identity. Numbers had measured taste, but they had failed to measure belonging. The original formula was quietly restored, because some things cannot be improved through data alone, and what people love is not always what they prefer in a test. The Choluteca Bridge, built for a river that moved in Honduras, engineers constructed a modern bridge. It was strong, well designed, built to last. Then Hurricane Mitch arrived in 1998. The storm was catastrophic. Roads were destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, but the bridge survived. It stood exactly as designed. There was only one problem. The river beneath it had moved. The floodwaters had carved an entirely new path. The bridge remained, spanning a riverbed that no longer existed. Perfectly engineered, completely useless, because the world had changed around it, and it had not been built to adapt, only to endure. The Aral Sea, draining the future. In the 1960s, Soviet planners made a decision: divert the rivers feeding the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton fields in the desert. The logic was clear. More water for crops. More crops meant more production. More production meant more power. What they did not account for was what would happen to the sea itself. Over the following decades, the Aral Sea, once one of the largest lakes in the world, shrank, then shrank further, then nearly disappeared. Fishing villages were left stranded miles from the water. Ships sat rusting in the sand. The regional climate changed. Dust storms carrying salt and pesticide residue began spreading across the area. An entire ecosystem collapsed, not in one moment, but across decades of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Because when you remove one piece from a natural system, you do not just lose that piece, you change everything connected to it. The Bre-X scandal, gold that never existed. In the 1990s, a small Canadian mining company announced something extraordinary. They had discovered gold in the jungles of Borneo. Not just some gold, the largest gold deposit ever found. Investors rushed in. The stock price soared. Billions were poured into the company. Governments negotiated. Partners competed. The world believed. There was only one problem. There was no gold. Core samples had been salted with shavings from jewelry. The entire discovery was fabricated. When the truth emerged, the stock collapsed almost instantly. Billions of dollars in investor money vanished, because extraordinary claims create extraordinary belief, and belief stops asking questions. The thalidomide disaster, testing without understanding. In the late 1950s, a drug called thalidomide was prescribed across Europe and beyond. It was effective at reducing morning sickness in pregnant women. It was approved quickly, distributed widely, and then children were born with severe limb deformities, thousands of them, across multiple countries. The drug had been tested, but not tested on pregnant subjects, not tested for what it did to developing life. The assumption was that if it was safe for adults, it was safe for everyone. That assumption reshaped thousands of lives permanently. The mistake was not the drug. It was the certainty that existing tests were enough, because what you don't test for, you cannot see coming. Leaning Tower of Pisa, beauty built on instability construction, began in 1173. Within years, the ground beneath one side began to sink. The soil was soft, the foundation was shallow, engineers noticed, but construction continued anyway, because the project had already begun. Money had been spent. Stopping felt like failure, so they built upward, and the tower leaned further. For centuries, it remained standing, not because the problem was solved, but because additional interventions kept it from collapsing entirely. Today, it is famous precisely because of its flaw. But what is celebrated as a wonder was originally a warning that once a foundation is wrong, everything built upon it carries that flaw, no matter how beautiful it becomes. The destruction of Baghdad's library. When knowledge burns. In 1258, the Mongol army arrived at Baghdad. At the time, Baghdad was the intellectual center of the world. The House of Wisdom held texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, accumulated across centuries from civilizations across the known world. When the city fell, the books were thrown into the Tigris River. It was said the water ran black with ink for days. Scholars estimate the knowledge loss set back scientific progress by centuries. Medicines that might have been discovered sooner. Calculations that had to be redone. Ideas that may have been lost forever. Because knowledge is not like stone. It does not rebuild itself. And once a generation of understanding is erased, the next generation must begin again. The dodo. Extinction through ignorance. When Dutch sailors arrived on the island of Mauritius in the late 1600s, they found an unusual bird, the dodo. It had no natural predators, no fear of humans, no instinct to flee. It walked toward the sailors, and the sailors ate them. Not maliciously, not with any plan, simply because they were there, easily caught, convenient. Within less than a century, the dodo was gone, completely, irrevocable. And the mistake was not hunger. It was the failure to understand that removing a species from its environment is permanent. There is no version 2, no second chance, no reversal, because extinction does not give warnings. It simply arrives, and then it is finished. The Hindenburg, the flammable symbol of progress. In 1937, the Hindenburg was the pinnacle of air travel, a massive airship, luxurious, majestic, crossing the Atlantic in days rather than weeks. It represented everything humanity believed it was becoming. But it was filled with hydrogen, highly flammable hydrogen. Helium was the safer option. It existed. It was available. But supply constraints and politics made hydrogen cheaper and more accessible. So, hydrogen it was. On May 6th, 1937, as the Hindenburg approached its mooring in New Jersey, a spark ignited. In 34 seconds, the airship was destroyed. 13 passengers died, 22 crew members, 1 worker on the ground. The entire disaster was filmed and broadcast on radio. The world watched an era end in flames, not because the technology was wrong, but because a known risk had been accepted and then forgotten. The millennium bug, fear of a number. As the year 2000 approached, the world panicked. Early computers had been programmed to read years with 2 digits. 1999 was 99, but 2000? That would read as 00, and 00 could be interpreted as 1900. The fear was real. Systems might crash. Banks might fail. Power grids could go dark. Governments and corporations spent an estimated $300 to $600 billion fixing, updating, and preparing. It became one of the most expensive software corrections in history. And then midnight arrived, and almost nothing happened. Some minor errors, quickly corrected. The disaster that consumed years of preparation never came. The mistake wasn't caution. Caution was reasonable. The mistake was a generation of engineers who had built systems so short-sighted that the arrival of a new century was a threat, because the decisions of the past always become the problems of the future.